I guess it's one of the pluses of receiving this award is that I'm just I think one of four Latino that have received it in this long history. So it's kind of it feels great to be able to be part of that and to continue, that lineage and to sort of demonstrate that we're still in there, we're still in the game, because when I was coming up, I rarely saw people who looked like me or whose names resembled mine, not only on the shelves but also in publication prizes or, it just wasn't. Those weren't placed for us, So that's one of the things that I set out was to change that, through being a book reviewer and a book critic and a reader and just anything and I could do. So it feels nice to be recognized for the 30 years that I spent doing that.
This being a Lifetime Achievement Award, do you see any particular thread or theme that's carried you across genres in your writing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are certain parts of me that are important to my work, and not only in poetry, but also fiction and nonfiction. One is certainly my ethnicity, my status as an immigrant to this country, the fact that I understand the border in ways that most people do not, because I wasn't raised on the border. I was raised in Mexico, but I lived on the border. I had my dealings with immigration, along with my grandparents and my parents. So, the kind of feeling as if you are always a stranger, always a foreigner, are not welcomed, even as I see my family and me contributing to this country, was difficult to negotiate. Right? So I think that sense of, perpetual displacement, but also trying to make a home out of a place that doesn't see you as somebody who belongs there. That's certainly in the work. My sexuality, coming out as a gay man is important in the work, because that was another way in which I felt alienated or isolated. And certainly being a ESL, and, learning English. English is my second language, and making that transition is also a kind of finding a home in a new place. And so those things are, I think find their way in all the work. The poverty that my family endured when we first arrived in the U.S. I come from generations of migrant farm workers, so that work, So as I hear all these things in the news, and I think they're so abstract to many people, And I wish that we could distribute our books and be like, well, here, you want an insight into who these people are? Read this book, because I read a whole book about the migrant farm workers and crossing vines,
Adrian
Matika.
Mm-hmm. describes your poetry as scrumptious and rich in its curiosities and carnalities. How do you hear interpretations or descriptions of your work?
Oh, I hope yeah, I hope it means that it's rich in imagery. I mean, I think that's what it's going for. That's something that I've always loved to work with in my language, is the descriptive language, the sensory language, the language that evokes, both emotion, but also, the senses, texture and sound and so forth. And also, I think it's there's substance to it. It's not just you hear it and you move on. You got to think about it. So much of my poetry is actually not until recently. I think it has not been autobiographical, only because I write nonfiction memoir. So I felt that that's where I place myself, my story, my particular experience. In poetry, I like to work with characters who resemble people that I know, people that I've met, or even circumstances that I feel there's some sense of injustice or some invisibility. That's important to me too, is to give visibility where I think people are made invisible. That coming from a family of working class, farm workers, we're always invisible, And even adjusting to school, my brothers, my cousins and I had a difficult time because we were not English speakers, because we were children of migrant farm workers. And even the other Mexican kids didn't like us, we were too strange even for them, right? And so we were made invisible. And so we kind of had to hang out with ourselves and see ourselves in order to be seen, because we were not going to be seen by anybody outside unless we did something wrong. Then they saw us right away, right? But otherwise, you're invisible, right? And I saw the same thing happening with my family. We would go on to the town and go to the market and go to the, the stores or the laundromat, and I would see that people were almost invested in distancing and themselves from us because we were the new arrivals, and I think that prejudice really was more impactful. And so whenever I'm sort of asked, have you encountered racism? I'm like, well, yes and no. I mean, racism eventually, but when I met white people, but I hadn't met white people. We lived in a community that was like 100%, Mexican American, and yet that's where I encountered all this prejudice and discrimination. So this idea that that racism or discrimination comes from that group to this group, like it's a little more complicated than that. And so I think that that's what I want to explore in my work, the complications of that, not to make accusations or indictments, but just to ask people to reflect a little more than just sort of see things as demarcated so specifically. It's like, no, things are nuanced, things are complicated. Which is why, we are in the situation that we are now, because people still insist on seeing things this way or that way, left or right, and that's not the way the world works, and yet that's the way you want to see the world.
How have you seen your presence and your work inform future writers?
I think in terms of what the work was, like I said earlier, I did book reviews, I promoted these books, I talked about these books, I made people aware about these books, and so that created a community, a large community. It was important, also the social media was finally sort of making an appearance, so that was a game changer because all of a sudden we're in touch with people who we were not going to see, on that everyday basis, but we could communicate with, now and again. So we created this online community, something beyond Facebook. I think first it was email, and then kind of Facebook, and then eventually the other ways that we could build community. And I think that if anything, I believe that what I showed, even my own Latino community, was that we were not alone, that we were easily accessible, and that we're here to champion each other. We're here to cheerlead each other because we were not getting that from other places. So, and not to expect it, not to expect from other places, that they were not necessarily going to look out for us, that some of the conversations happening in this country were also very, black and white, as if there's only two races. I'm like, well, no, there's actually more complicated than that, and that continues to be the case, I think, in some ways. So that leaves out any other group, and also that it's false to think that we are segregated. We look at the history of the civil rights movement and social movements in this country, and there was always solidarity, there was always interconnectedness. And I think we need to go back to that. I think that right now there's too many sort of separations and segregations to be like, oh no, that group did this and this group did that. And I'm thinking, it's so false and disingenuous. And that's sort of participating in keeping us apart. And when you do that, we don't have the critical mass to really fight back and push back against something. I think that's really a problem right now.
Can you share the difference between your writing style 30 years ago and your writing, like your approach to writing today?
Oh, that's a good question. And I actually been thinking a lot about that, only because as a teacher, as a professor, and I guide these very talented young poets, and I always tell them, you have to be deliberate, be deliberate, be deliberate. And I said, eventually you'll internalize it and you don't have to think too much about it because it'll be part of your process. But in the beginning, you have to be deliberate. And I think that I really did reach that point in my life where I don't have to force myself to do things on the page. Maybe you'll be aware of what I do on the page. But in terms of subject matter, or how did I approach things, I think I become, I think when I was younger, I was a little more fearless. I was a little more daring, risk-taking, not only in terms of the subject matter, but in the voice that I had on the page. Like, they were unapologetic, sometimes they were confrontational, sometimes they were loud, sometimes they were, even unpleasant. I wasn't afraid to do that. And I think in my old age, I've gotten, sort of become a softie in some ways. Like I'm more emotional about things. I'm becoming my father. My father had this issue. I remember my stepmother telling me, your father, sometimes he's sitting on the couch watching TV and he's watching a commercial and he starts crying. I'm like, why are you crying over a commercial? And I couldn't even picture that because my father was not that kind of a person. He was he wasn't hard nosed or anything, but, I always saw him as very strong and not sort of that emotionally, you know, fragile. And I think I understand that now. I think after so many years, you kind of break down a little bit, or you know that it's more effort to resist than to just let it go. Nobody's gonna throw you onto the street if you just have a good cry. It's okay. It's okay to be, but also that I think it has to do with issues of masculinity too in our many cultures, that men don't cry and you have to show strength, and that's crying is weakness. And I think that even though I've never had those issues, even though I confronted them when I was younger, I knew that as a gay boy, that was not going to be my world. But as a grown up, but even growing up, and you had to sort of be strong, even if you were queer, if you were gay. Otherwise, you saw yourself as if somebody saw you as weak, you become a victim. You become, subject to ridicule at the most innocuous, or you could be a victim of violence. I mean, that's the reality, of us. So I think that there was that need. So all that to say is that I just become a little more open to vulnerability in ways that I didn't think I would be at this age.
In your work with younger poets, how do you respond when you are confronted with a poet's doubts and self-doubt, either in their writing or just in conversation?
Oh, that happens a lot, actually. That happens a lot. Where young poets, they have like the imposter syndrome, they call it, or they feel that they begin to compare themselves with the other talented people in the room, because probably in where they come from, they were probably the big fish. But then when you get all these big fish and you put them in one pond, there's no big fish, But you can also feel like the little fish. You see all these big fish. So I think that's one of the issues. We bring such a talented group, and all of a sudden, they're like, oh, well, maybe they're not that talented or as talented, right? And so doubt is difficult to overcome. But this is something that I give my little speech and my little pep talk to them, is that, the thing about doubt is that if everybody in the room doubts you and you don't, you can still accomplish something. But if everybody in the room believes in you and you still doubt, you're not going to accomplish anything, right? So it's up to you. It's your agency. You're the one that can really overcome that. Because no matter what kind of cheerleading rally you have around you, it's not going to get anywhere if you do not believe in yourself, right? So that has to be overcome. How do you do that? Well, you remind yourself, why is it that you're here? Why is it that you turn to poetry? Those initial impulses, or that desire, or that dream. What are the roots of it? Why did you decide one day that, what, I'm going to invest time and energy and invest, sacrifice time away from my family, from my friends, from things that I love, to do this other thing that I love? Well, what was it that, allowed you to make the decision? Remind yourself, about that.
Where do you place poetry, not in terms of importance, but in terms of value, in providing colorful, contoured documentation of history?
I think the hardest thing for my students, or even other writers who are now writing, to grapple with is that whatever we write now, whatever we produce, is going to be seen through the lens of the historical moment. So there's no way that we can pretend that thing happening in the world is not going to affect the way that readers in the future read what we write. So we have one or two choices. We can keep pretending that that's not happening and let other people sort of see and maybe even come to the conclusion that this person was in complete denial. This person did not look out the window, because clearly they're like talking, writing about this and that, and then to do with like, were they watching TV, listening to the news, or what? What were these people? Or you can just meet the moment and be like, okay, what is going to be my form of resistance? What is going to be my form of creating, if I'm creating joy or something positive or something, creating beauty, what is it that I'm fighting against? And you don't always have to identify that, but the fact that you're creating that, I think will be seen through that same lens. So you have to find a way, because it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. And this is something that I tell, and the reason I know that's true is because we do that all the time. As readers, as critics, as professors, okay, let's look at this literature of the 70s. What was happening in the 70s? That's the first question that we ask. Not like, what was this person doing? What was this person thinking? No, what was happening in the world? Because our writing and all art does not happen in a vacuum, right? And so it has to reflect, it has to mirror, it has to push back, or something. There's some kind of interaction, right? But the one that I believe is not the one that's going to help us is the one that just pretends that it's not happening, right? It's not, that's not going to benefit anybody.
Other poets and storytellers that you are in dialogue and discussion and playful debate with in your writing?
It's a long lineage. I've been so fortunate that I've had so many stages in my life where I'm drawn to certain poets. Like specifically the Chicano and Latino poets are important to me because I feel as if I'm part of the lineage, part of that family conversations. For me, it's like these are the folks that showed me, that opened the door, that showed me how to think about family, think about community, think about myself, my identity, right? So these poets like Juan Felipe Herrera, like even Martin Espada or Gary Soto, Alberto Rios, Luis Cervantes. I mean, the list is long of Sandra Cisneros, the people that were really instrumental in sort of showing me, okay, how is it that language can serve as a mirror to the things that we have not only inside of our hearts, but also inside of our houses, inside of our homes, right? These are the folks that showed me how to do that, and do that respectfully, but also do that knowing that sometimes what we see is not pretty. It's not. There's also, I always say that the first monsters we encounter are in your own house. The first instances of unkindness and cruelty happen in your house, right? And then eventually you meet them outside. So we have to be realistic. We have to be honest about that, very much. After that, I think instrumental in my work were African American poets. African American poets in this country are the leaders of voice, of the leaders of vision. They've always have been. They've always been very supportive in the 70s and 80s, very supportive of other communities of poets, and in terms of championing, and also I always go back to this one anecdote when Gwendolyn Brooks was the poet laureate in the 80s, and then she invites, she says, oh, I have this anthology and there are no Latino poets in it. So I'm going to bring Latino poets to Library of Congress to do a reading. And I was just like blown away because there's a recording of it in the archives. I was blown away. And she brings in, Sandra Cisneros, Luis Cervantes, Alberto Rios, I just mentioned, and also Luis Omar Salinas. And these, at that time, like, I think one of them had one book. I think they had one book each. And I think one of them had a chapbook. Sandra Cisneros had a chapbook. I'm like, oh my, it's just so, and I thought, she didn't have to do any of that. Gwendolyn Brooks did not have to do that. And I think that in her perspective, she did, because she saw something that was absent, that was, and so I think we need more of that energy, right? And we need to dispel the myth that we are insular, that we are isolated, because it's not true. Our education, as poets, as artists, comes from other groups. And for me, the African American poets, they continue to be the leaders in this country of poetry and many other arts, So when it comes to thinking about how is it that we engage with race and why we should participate in sort of like fighting these injustices, this is why. Because they're so important. It's so important to us And after that, there's a whole other, very diverse group, including, just to dispel the myth that I don't read any white poets, because I do. The confessional poets, were important to me. Just yesterday, I was showing one of my students about a poem by Sylvia Plath called "Widow," and I said, "This is the poem that taught me how to do this particular thing." And I brought it out on the screen and I showed it to her, and it just reminded me of, like, again, that early engagement, not only with, like, from the confessional poets. They were writing so uh, personally about their traumas and their interior struggles in ways that were challenging sort of the norms, and also opened the door for what I think poetry does in contemporary poetry. We see all the time is people sort of, they're called confessions because they were confessing, but really they were examining, they were exploring, they were even admitting, of things that you just didn't do in poetry. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to be that personal. And then here they broke open the walls so that the private became public.